Grayson Steele was a man who controlled everything, until that night, sitting in a high-end restaurant, enjoying his solitude, his world shattered in an instant. Across the room, he saw his ex, but it wasn't just her. Two identical boys sat beside her, and the moment his eyes locked onto them, he knew his life would never be the same. How will this encounter with his ex and her twins change his life? Stay tuned to find out as this gripping story unfolds with unexpected twists. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Let's begin the story. Grayson Steele was a man who had spent his entire life mastering control. Emotions were weaknesses, distractions that had no place in the empire he had built. That night, seated at his usual table in Vermilion Prime, New York's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, he allowed himself a rare moment of indulgence. The whiskey in his glass swirled lazily, the amber liquid catching the glow of the dim candlelight. Around him, conversations flowed in hushed tones, laughter punctuating the air as business elites and socialites basked in their wealth. The world of luxury suited him, and yet there was an emptiness that even the finest spirits and highest successes could not fill. Then, as if fate had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, his gaze locked onto a vision that nearly stopped his heart. Across the room, seated at a corner table, was Ava Sinclair, the woman who had disappeared from his life 3 years ago without a trace, the only woman who had ever made him feel anything beyond ambition, the woman who had left behind nothing but unanswered questions in a void he had refused to acknowledge. But it wasn't just her presence that shattered the careful structure of his world. 2 little boys sat beside her, black, identical, around 2 years old. A cold, numbing sensation gripped him as he studied them, his pulse a steady, heavy drum against his ribs. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need confirmation. He saw himself in them, the same sharp jawline, the same piercing dark eyes that had once stared back at him from old childhood photos. His grip tightened around his glass, the ice shifting with the force of his hold. His mind raced, trying to process the reality that was unfolding before him. 2 sons, his sons. And he had never even known they existed. The restaurant that had moments ago felt like a sanctuary of order and predictability now felt claustrophobic. The hum of conversation blurred, the warm lighting now casting long, suffocating shadows. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the storm rising inside him, but the questions, the betrayal, the undeniable truth burned through his veins like fire. 3 years, 2 children, and not a single word from her. Grayson had been many things in his life, ruthless, calculating, feared, but he had never been a man to abandon what was his. Yet here he was, standing in the wreckage of a life he hadn't even realized had been stolen from him. Rising from his seat, he moved with quiet precision, his steps slow, measured, deliberate. Every muscle in his body coiled with tension as he approached her table. Ava had not yet noticed him, too lost in whatever world she had built in his absence. He wondered if she ever thought of him, if she had ever once felt the weight of the decision she had made. Then, as if sensing the inevitable, she looked up. The moment her gaze met his, something flickered across her face. First, recognition, then panic, and beneath it all, an emotion he had never seen in her before, guilt. Ava's fingers tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles whitening as she swallowed hard. He could see the way she tried to compose herself, tried to mask the storm raging within her. But she couldn't hide from him. She never could. He stood at the edge of the table, his presence an unspoken demand. The children continued their innocent chatter, unaware of the suffocating tension that had settled between the 2 adults. His voice, when it finally came, was low and unwavering, each word laced with quiet fury. "Are they mine?" The air thickened with the weight of the question. He watched as she hesitated, the muscles in her throat working as she searched for an answer she wasn't ready to give. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "No." The single syllable cut through him like a blade, a blatant lie. She didn't even believe it herself. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she shifted uncomfortably, in the way she held herself as if bracing for impact. Before he could press her further, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. A man approached, tall, well-dressed, polished, white. He placed a hand on Ava's back, an easy gesture of familiarity that made something dark and primal coil inside Grayson's chest. Ava had left him for this, Had erased him from their children's lives only to replace him with another man? His teeth clenched, a slow, simmering rage burning beneath his skin, but he did not let it show. Instead, he took a step back, his expression unreadable, his body coiled with restraint. Without another word, he turned and walked away. But this was far from over. Ava Sinclair had stolen his children from him. She had taken away years he could never get back, had buried the truth beneath lies and silence. He had never been a man who let things slip beyond his control, and he wasn't about to start now. He would uncover every secret she had kept from him, and when he did, she would have no choice but to face the truth. Grayson Steele had built his empire on precision, on knowing every angle of a situation before making his move. He had never once entered a deal without knowing every risk, every contingency, every weakness that could be exploited. And yet, for 3 years, he had walked through life oblivious to the fact that he had 2 sons. That alone made him question everything. Sitting in his penthouse, the dim glow of city lights reflecting off the polished marble floors, he ran a hand over his jaw, his patience thinning with every passing second. Across from him, Darius Carter, a former intelligence officer turned private investigator, flipped through a leather-bound notebook with the casual air of a man accustomed to uncovering the darkest secrets. "She moved 4 times in the last 3 years, Darius said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Boston, Atlanta, Chicago, and then back to New York. Never stayed longer than a year in any place. Always rented, never bought. No traceable relationships. No employers that could give any real details. She's been keeping herself off the radar." Grayson's fingers curled into fists. Ava had been running. The question was, from what? Or rather, from whom? Darius slid a manila folder across the table. Grayson picked it up, his eyes scanning the first document inside. The twins' birth certificates. His jaw tightened as he read the details. Their last name was listed as Sinclair. The space for the father's name had been left blank. She had erased him, not just from her life, but from theirs. A slow, simmering anger built inside him. He wasn't the kind of man who let go of what was his. Ava had made a choice, and now she would have to answer for it. Darius leaned back in his chair, watching him. "There's more." Grayson looked up, his patience wearing thin. "Get to the point." "Ethan Monroe, the man from the restaurant," Darius said. "Corporate lawyer. Specializes in asset protection and high-value estates. But he's not her husband. Hell, he's not even her boyfriend. He's just the guy who handled some of her legal matters." Grayson's grip on the folder tightened. She wasn't with him. So why had she let him think otherwise? Darius continued, his tone shifting. "Now here's where things get interesting. The last address she lived at before coming back to New York was a property owned by Eleanor Steele." The name hit Grayson like a punch to the gut. His mother. His jaw locked, a slow realization settling in. Ava hadn't just left. She had been forced out. Pushing his chair back, he stood, his movements controlled but laced with barely restrained fury. "Get me everything. Every call, every email, every record of interaction between my mother and Ava." Darius gave a slow nod, already pulling out his phone. "I'll have it by morning." Grayson didn't respond. He was already walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, his mind racing. His own mother had orchestrated this. She had taken his children from him before he even knew they existed, and that was something he would never forgive. The townhouse in Harlem was modest but well-maintained, a far cry from the penthouses and estates Ava had once been accustomed to. She had built a life here, one far away from the world they had once shared. That fact alone made Grayson's chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to regret. He climbed the steps, his movements deliberate, controlled. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here for answers. Answers that had been kept from him for far too long. He knocked once, then again, harder this time. Several moments passed before the door finally cracked open. Ava stood there, her face set in a mask of indifference, but he saw the flash of apprehension in her eyes. She had expected this, expected him. "We're not doing this, Grayson." Her voice was calm, but there was tension in her shoulders, in the way she held the door as if preparing to shut it in his face. He let out a slow breath, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Yes, we are." Her eyes flickered with something unreadable before she stepped forward, closing the door behind her. She wasn't about to let him into her home, into the world she had built without him. That much was clear. "What do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms. His gaze was steady, unwavering. You already know the answer to that. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't respond. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me about them? She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I had my reasons. A muscle in her jaw twitched. It's the only answer you're getting. He studied her, the tension between them thick enough to suffocate. Then, in a quieter voice, he asked, Did my mother have something to do with this? Her breath hitched just slightly. It was so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But he did. She swallowed, looking away. That was all the confirmation he needed. His mother had been involved. She had orchestrated this, just as she had manipulated every other aspect of his life. Ava had been pushed out, forced into hiding, and for 3 years he had been blind to it all. Grayson took another step closer, his voice tightening. You let me believe you left because you wanted to. Ava's gaze snapped back to his, something fierce igniting in her eyes. I did what I had to do to protect them. His chest constricted. From me. Her silence cut deeper than any words could have. A sound from inside broke the moment, a small voice, curious but hesitant. Mommy? Grayson looked past her and saw one of the twins standing in the hallway. For a moment, everything else fell away. The anger, the betrayal, the years of absence, his son. The boy looked at him with wide, dark eyes, the same eyes Grayson saw in the mirror every morning. There was something cautious in his expression, as if he knew, on some instinctual level, that the man standing at the door was someone important. Grayson swallowed, something shifting inside him. Ava moved first, turning to the child with a soft smile. Go back inside, sweetheart. I'll be there in a minute. The boy hesitated for only a moment before nodding and disappearing back into the house. Grayson exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. Ava's voice was quieter now, almost resigned. You have no idea what I went through, what I had to do to keep them safe. His voice was steady, but there was something raw in it now. Then tell me. She hesitated. Then finally she whispered, I tried, Grayson. I tried to tell you, but every call, every message, I was blocked at every turn. And when I realized who was behind it, it was already too late. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His mother had severed every line of communication. She had cut Ava out of his life before he had even known what he was losing. For the first time in years, Grayson Steele wasn't sure if he could fix what had been broken. But one thing was certain. He wasn't walking away. Grayson Steele had never known powerlessness. He had spent his life building an empire where every outcome bent to his will. He dictated the terms, controlled the risks, and ensured that nothing, no person, no circumstance could ever blindside him. And yet, here he stood, staring at the closed door of Ava's home, knowing that for 3 years the most important part of his life had been ripped away from him, manipulated beyond his control. The truth burned through him like acid, igniting a rage he hadn't felt in years. His mother, Eleanor Steele, the woman who had orchestrated boardroom takeovers with ruthless precision, had turned that same cold efficiency against him. She had decided that Ava wasn't worthy, that their children weren't necessary, and she had made sure that Grayson never even knew they existed. And he had been too blind, too focused on his empire, to question why Ava had vanished without a trace. His hands clenched at his sides as he walked toward his car, each step calculated, his mind already forming the next move. He wasn't the type of man to sit in his anger. He acted, he retaliated, he restored order. And right now, there was only one person who could give him the answers he needed. Less than an hour later, his car pulled up to the sprawling estate in the Upper East Side, a symbol of old money and untouchable power. The house he had grown up in, the house where his mother had dictated his life with iron will and strategic precision. The butler barely had time to open the door before Grayson strode past him, his presence a storm in the carefully curated calm of Eleanor Steele's world. She was seated in the grand parlor, a glass of wine in her hand, poised as always, untouched by time or guilt. She didn't flinch when he entered, didn't so much as raise an eyebrow at his presence. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine before setting the glass down with deliberate care. I was wondering when you'd come, she said smoothly, her voice carrying that unshakable, aristocratic calm. You always were sharp, my dear, but sometimes you take longer than necessary to see what's right in front of you. Grayson didn't bother with pleasantries. You kept my children from me. His voice was low, steady, but thick with restrained fury. You made sure I never knew. Eleanor sighed, reaching for the silk napkin beside her and dabbing at the corner of her mouth, as if this conversation was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. I did what needed to be done. Ava was a distraction, a weakness you couldn't afford. You have spent your entire life building Steel Financial, building an empire that will last for generations, and I will not allow a woman like her to sabotage that legacy. Grayson's jaw clenched, the weight of her words pressing against the fury already boiling inside him. He had always known his mother was cold, but this was beyond manipulation. This was theft. You had no right, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You decided for me. You erased them from my life, my blood, my children. Do you even understand what you've done? Eleanor lifted her chin, her expression unwavering. I saved you. Her voice didn't waver, didn't crack under the force of his anger. Ava would have tethered you to a life of mediocrity. She was nothing but a temporary indulgence, a woman who did not belong in the world you were meant to rule. You were too blind to see it, so I made the choice for you. Grayson's hands curled into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His own mother had not just interfered. She had dictated his future, playing God with his life and the lives of his children as if they were mere assets on a balance sheet. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. He took a step closer, his presence looming over her, his voice colder than she had ever heard. You don't get to decide who belongs in my life. You don't get to erase my family because they don't fit into your polished world. His gaze burned into hers, his fury barely contained. You took 3 years from me, Eleanor. 3 years I will never get back, and I swear to you, I will never let you interfere again. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment before exhaling, almost bored with his reaction. Do you think this changes anything, Grayson? Do you think she'll let you back in? You're 3 years too late. Grayson stared at her, the finality of her words settling in his chest like lead. Eleanor had always believed in winning, in ensuring that no battle was left uncertain, and for 3 years she had assumed she had won. She was wrong. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the estate behind him. He would undo the damage she had done, no matter what it took. Ava had spent years convincing herself that she had made the right decision. She had buried the pain, the what-ifs, the memories of what life with Grayson had once been. But when she had seen him standing at her door, the storm in his eyes barely restrained, she had known that her past was no longer something she could outrun. Her hands trembled slightly as she leaned against the kitchen counter, her mind still reeling from the confrontation. She had always known this moment would come. She had spent years dreading it, but nothing could have prepared her for the way he had looked at her, the weight of his fury, the sheer determination in his voice. She had thought keeping the twins away from him had been the only way to protect them, but now she wasn't sure if she had been protecting them, or protecting herself. A small voice interrupted her thoughts. Mommy? She turned, her gaze softening as Noah tugged at her sleeve, his sleepy eyes blinking up at her. Can I have some water? Ava knelt down, brushing his curls away from his forehead. Of course, baby. Let's get you some. As she poured him a glass, she felt a wave of something dangerously close to regret crash over her. She had done everything she could to keep them safe, but had she taken too much from them in the process? Had she taken too much from him? The knock on the door made her pulse spike. She knew who it was before she even turned. Taking a steadying breath, she walked toward the door and pulled it open. Grayson stood there, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the small space between them. I'm not going away, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I will fight for them. I will fight for you. But I need the truth, Ava. The whole truth. Her heart pounded, her hands gripping the edge of the door. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of the past alone. Maybe it was time to share the burden. Maybe it was time to stop running. Ava had expected anger. She had expected accusations, maybe even threats. But as she finished speaking, revealing the nightmare that had forced her to run, Grayson said nothing. He stood there, rigid, unreadable, his fists clenched at his sides. For years, she had carried this burden alone, suffocating under the weight of choices she hadn't wanted to make. Now, the truth was out, and she had no idea what came next. Grayson's voice, when it came, was controlled but sharp. You should have told me. Ava felt frustration flare. I tried, Grayson, But by the time I realized what was happening, your mother had already blocked every way I could reach you. I had two choices: stay and risk losing them forever, or leave." His jaw clenched, his breathing heavy. She could see the storm building in his expression, the same cold fury she had seen in him back when he was forced to negotiate ruthless business deals. But this was personal. Grayson turned away, running a hand over his face. "She really thought I'd let this slide." He let out a sharp breath, then met her gaze with unwavering intensity. "I'm not letting her get away with this, Ava, and I sure as hell am not letting her near them ever again." Ava crossed her arms, her tone wary. "What does that mean?" "It means Eleanor Steele just made the biggest mistake of her life," Grayson said darkly. "And I'm going to make sure she pays for it." Ava's stomach twisted. She had spent 3 years avoiding a fight with his family, convinced she couldn't win. But now, Grayson was here, and he wasn't backing down. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe she didn't have to fight alone anymore. Grayson arrived at Ava's townhouse before sunrise. He hadn't slept. There had been no time for rest, not when his mother had manipulated the last 3 years of his life and stolen his children from him. His mind had worked through the night, making calls, setting plans into motion. He had built an empire through strategy and ruthless efficiency, and now he was turning that same force toward protecting his family. Ava opened the door cautiously, her expression guarded. "You're back." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to trust me," he said, stepping inside. "I'm going to make sure you and the twins are safe, but I can't do that if you keep shutting me out." Ava exhaled, crossing her arms. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" He didn't hesitate. "First, I'm cutting Eleanor off, completely. She won't be able to touch you, legally or otherwise. Second, I need to establish my parental rights. If something happens, if she tries anything again, I need to be able to protect them." Ava flinched at the mention of legality, her expression tightening. "And if I don't agree?" Grayson's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "Then I'll wait, but I won't disappear, Ava. Not this time." The words hit their mark. For years, she had feared this exact moment, Grayson stepping back into their lives and taking control. But now, as she looked at him, she didn't see the ruthless businessman she had once feared. She saw a father who had been robbed of his children, and that terrified her more than anything. Ava had spent 3 years keeping the twins in a world separate from Grayson Steele. Now, in the span of 24 hours, that world was on the verge of collapsing. She sat stiffly at the kitchen table, watching as Grayson stood in the living room, his eyes locked on the 2 little boys who had no idea the man standing before them was their father. Liam was the first to notice him. The livelier of the twins, he glanced up, curiosity flickering across his face. "Who are you?" he asked, tilting his head. Ava opened her mouth to speak, but Grayson was faster. He crouched down, leveling himself with the boys. "I'm Grayson." He hesitated for half a second before adding, "I'm a friend of your mom's." Noah, always the quiet observer, studied him carefully. His gaze was sharp, eerily familiar, the same way Grayson himself had always sized up a situation before deciding his next move. Liam wasn't convinced. "You're big," he said bluntly. "Are you a superhero?" Grayson let out a low chuckle. "No, but I'm working on it." Ava folded her arms, shifting uncomfortably as the conversation unfolded. This was happening too fast. The boys didn't know him. They didn't understand what this moment meant, and yet she could see it in Grayson's expression, the raw emotion he was trying so hard to hide. Noah finally spoke. "Are you going to come back?" The room went silent. Ava inhaled sharply, her heart tightening. She had spent their whole lives trying to shield them from abandonment, from false promises. Noah had always been the more cautious of the two, the one who noticed things even when she wished he wouldn't. Grayson didn't look away. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be back." Noah stared at him for a long moment before giving a small nod, as if testing him. Ava wasn't sure if she wanted to cry or stop this before it went any further, because deep down, she knew there was no stopping it now. Ava barely slept that night. The moment she had spent years dreading had arrived, and there was no undoing it. Grayson was here, in their lives, and she didn't know how to stop the inevitable pull that would bring him closer. He had promised Noah he would return. A promise meant nothing if it couldn't be kept. By mid-morning, she found herself pacing the living room, debating whether she should set boundaries or prepare for war. Then, as if answering the question for her, there was a knock at the door. Grayson. She opened it, barely getting a word out before he stepped inside, his energy direct and determined. "We need to talk," he said. Ava folded her arms, wary. "About what?" Grayson's jaw clenched, but his voice was controlled. "Eleanor." A chill ran down her spine. "What did she do?" His expression darkened. "She made a move this morning, sent legal paperwork demanding full custody. She's claiming you're unfit to raise the twins, that they should be under my guardianship," meaning hers. "She's trying to cut you out completely." Ava's breath hitched, panic rushing in fast. This was what she had been afraid of. The very thing that had kept her running. No, she can't do that. "She thinks she can," Grayson corrected. "She has power, resources, and enough connections to make your life hell if we don't act fast. But she made one mistake. She assumed I'd back her." Ava swallowed, her hands trembling at her sides. "And will you?" His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "No." The certainty in his voice nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. For 3 years she had believed that if Grayson ever found out, he would fight for control, not for her. But now, he was standing here, defying the woman who had controlled his life for decades. "I won't let her take them from you, Ava," he continued, stepping closer. His voice softer but no less firm. "I won't let her take them from us." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had survived too much to break now. "What do we do?" Grayson reached into his coat and handed her a folder. "I already filed an emergency injunction. My lawyers are preparing a case to shut this down before it even gets to court. But we need to be united. If you fight me, Eleanor wins. We have to show them that the twins belong with both of us." Ava's pulse pounded in her ears. It was happening so fast, spinning out of her control. Yet, as much as she wanted to push back, she knew the truth. Fighting Grayson wasn't the answer. Fighting Eleanor was. After a long moment, she exhaled and nodded. "Okay." Grayson's shoulders relaxed slightly, but there was still tension in his stance. "I need to prove something to them, Ava. I need to be recognized as their father legally. It's the only way to ensure no one, not even Eleanor, can ever do this again." Ava's heart twisted. She had spent so long keeping the twins away from him, but this was different. This wasn't about her fears anymore. It was about protecting them. "I'll sign the papers." For the first time, something like relief flashed in his eyes, but it was fleeting. There was still a war ahead, and they both knew it. 2 days later, Ava sat in a conference room across from Eleanor Steele. Her body stiff as ice-cold fury radiated off the older woman. The law offices of Winthrop and Crane were neutral ground, but Eleanor looked as if she owned the place, sitting regally with her team of lawyers flanking her sides. Grayson sat beside Ava, calm, unreadable. But the tension in his shoulders told her he was barely holding himself together. "I must say, I'm disappointed," Eleanor said smoothly, her manicured fingers drumming against the polished mahogany table. "I thought you of all people would have better sense than to let her manipulate you." Grayson didn't flinch. "And I thought you would have better sense than to challenge me on this." Eleanor's gaze darkened. "You're making a mistake. This woman ran from you. She kept your children from you. And you're choosing her over your legacy?" Grayson leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "My children are my legacy, and the fact that you tried to erase them from my life tells me everything I need to know about you." Eleanor's expression barely shifted, but there was something in her eyes, something cold and unforgiving. "You think she won't run again?" "I don't need to think. I know she won't, because she doesn't have to anymore," Grayson said. His words were simple, but they carried a finality that left no room for doubt. Ava exhaled slowly, willing her hands to stay steady as the lawyer beside her slid the final agreement across the table. It outlined everything: joint custody, legal recognition of Grayson as their father, and an ironclad clause ensuring that Eleanor Steele would have no rights, no access, and no influence over Noah and Liam's lives. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she signed it. She had no choice. The moment her pen lifted, Ava felt the tight grip around her chest loosen. It was done. Eleanor pushed back her chair, standing with the kind of poise that came from always believing you were untouchable. But this time, she had lost. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said to Grayson. He didn't even look at her. "I do." And with that, Eleanor Steele walked out of their lives for good. Later that night, Ava sat on her front porch, the weight of the last few days finally settling. It was over. Eleanor was gone. The legal battle was won. And yet, there was still one thing left unanswered. What came next? She heard footsteps behind her. Grayson. He sat beside her, silent for a long moment before he spoke. They asked about me today. Ava turned to him, surprised. What did you say? The truth, that I'm their dad. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Noah asked if I was going to stay. Ava's chest tightened. And? Grayson's gaze met hers, steady and certain. I told him I would, as long as you'll let me. Her heart pounded, fear and hope warring inside her. She had spent years keeping him out, but today he had fought for her, for them. She wasn't sure how to move forward from here, but one thing was clear: she didn't want to do it alone. She let out a slow breath. Stay for dinner? It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a promise, but it was something. Grayson smiled. Yeah, I'd like that. And for the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't something to be feared anymore. For the first time in years, Ava no longer felt alone. The fear, the uncertainty, the weight of protecting her children, it wasn't just hers to carry anymore. Grayson had fought for them, not with power, but with the determination of a man who refused to walk away. Trust would take time, but this was a start. Sometimes second chances aren't about fixing the past, but choosing a better future. What would you have done in Ava's place? Could you forgive someone who came back after years of absence? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Your support makes these stories possible. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.